Against this backdrop, I will first recall Ricoeur's definition of the critical hermeneutical approach, mentioning one of its applications, that of his analysis of ideology and utopia. In a second moment, I will present the reflections of Michael Walzer and Axel Honneth on the possible paths of social criticism, elaborating on the notion of interpretation, the path chosen both by Walzer and Honneth in their social criticisms, and which bears resemblances with Ricoeur's own approach. Then, and having laid out some of the features of hermeneutical social criticism, I will briefly expand the discussion by connecting it to what I consider to be some of the main general traits of social hermeneutics, in order to then come back to Ricoeur in my very brief final notes. Let me just pause for a second to ask João to just keep control of who's in the waiting room, etc. Because given that I'm projecting the screen, I won't be.
Yes.
Thank you. So, third slide. In 1973, for recurrence, this is very well known, and so apologize me for just recalling these simple facts. But let's start here. So Ricoeur's critical hermeneutics. Now, in 1973, in his intervention in the famous Gadamer-Habermas debate, and namely in the article Hermeneutics and the Critique of Ideology, published in Hermeneutics in the Human Sciences, Ricoeur sets out to develop a type of hermeneutics doing justice to the critique of ideology. This is his goal. For Ricoeur, this amounts to arriving at a comprehensive standpoint. Philosophy needs to understand its situated character, the fact that it is always speaking from within a certain tradition, that its concepts do not just appear out of nowhere, and that it cannot be satisfied with a purely constructivist approach. However, in this approach, philosophy also needs to acknowledge that in certain situations, the already existing symbolic order needs to be shattered if we are to overcome injustice. Ricoeur's effort will thus be one of reconciling a reinterpretation of cultural heritages with an interest in emancipation as a practical project. And this is, in a nutshell, his project of a critical hermeneutics. Indeed, when assessing Habermasian critical theory, and I won't even go there because Vinicius is going to speak about it, just making a simple quote, Ricoeur explicitly adheres to its project of liberation. He goes so far as to state the interconnection between hermeneutics and liberation. Dussel then also wrote about this afterwards. But Ricoeur establishes an analogy between their mutual dependence, that is hermeneutics and the project of liberation, and Kant's description of the connection between concepts and intuitions. As Ricoeur states, hermeneutics without the project of liberation is blind, but a project of emancipation without historical experience is empty. End quote. This is from the lectures on ideology and utopia, which, as you certainly know, there were lectures given by Ricoeur in Chicago in 1975, and then edited by George Taylor and published by Columbia University Press in 1986. Now, Ricoeur's analysis of the dialectic between ideology and utopia is a privileged example of such critical hermeneutics at work, because it aims both at taking the existing symbolic social order as its starting point and at changing it through meaningful critique. Allow me to just very briefly elaborate on this. Ricoeur contends that social imagination is constitutive of social reality. Ideology is therefore constitutive, and insofar as it provides a symbolic function without which no community could be built, that of legitimating a given social ordering. So it is, in Ricoeur's social philosophy, a function of reproductive imagination. In this constitutive sense, and here I'm quoting Ricoeur, ideology, I'm quoting the lectures on ideology and utopia, ideology occurs in the gap between a system of authority's claim to legitimacy and our response in terms of belief. a little bit down the text, he adds, it happens to add a certain surplus value to our belief in order that our belief may meet the requirements of the authority's claim, end quote. And so this is Ricoeur's recovery and adaptation of the Weberian motivational model to the overall topic of the critique of ideology stemming from Marxism. Just admitting that. Sorry. So ideology in a constitutive sense is actually needed for societies to endure through time, and it is not inherently pathological. But ideologies can be pathological and assume a distorting function that calls for critique when they become petrified and admit of no alternative. This is why, he argues, we need utopias, which are products of productive rather than reproductive imagination. Let me just change the slide. That reveal the contingency of any given social order and formulate the possibility of alternative states of affairs, thus providing a path for possible path for social change. Now, Ricoeur suggests that there can be a productive dialectics between ideology and utopia, which means that utopias can be the yardstick to criticize ideologies and denaturalize them, revealing their contingency. Utopia is thus for Ricoeur an exploration of the possible, as it exercises a function of distanciation vis-a-vis existing social reality. Now, I follow Ricoeur in seeing utopias as a possible tool to criticize pathological ideologies. But it goes without saying that utopian criticism is not the only possible path for ideology critique. Moreover, the relation between the several types of critique, including immanent, transcendent, normative, and other types of critique that can be addressed to ideologies, goes well beyond the dialectical relation between ideology and utopia. Now, this project of both refraining from adopting purely constructivist approaches, that is, of starting from concrete existing social reality, and this not in a conservative, but rather in a transformative way, waging on criticism, finds meaningful echoes in other approaches. And so I reach the second moment of my presentation, which is Walser and Honneth on interpretation and reconstructive critique. So I will now focus on Michael Walser's notion of interpretation in the book Interpretation in Social Criticism, and in Axel Honneth's version of this kind of critique, which he calls reconstructive critique. Actually, in his article, Honneth's article, Reconstructive Social Criticism with a Genealogical Proviso on the idea of critique in the Frankfurt School, reproduced in the book Pathologies of Reason, Honneth starts by analyzing the typology of social criticisms proposed by Michael Walser in the book Interpretation in Social Criticism. Now, Walser distinguishes these types of social criticism according to the procedures used to identify the underlying norms and assumptions of a given society and to undertake social criticism. For Walser, thus, there are three main paths in moral philosophy. Discovery, you have them here, discovery, invention, and interpretation. Discovery references the social and critical approaches that appeal to an experience of religious or cognitive clarity in order to advance a socially closed realm of generally binding values. This is, in short, some sort of Platonism. Now, invention is the type of approach that starts by looking for a generally valid procedure and then tries to apply these norms to already existing societies. Finally, interpretation is to be understood as the hermeneutical dimension of the creative disclosure of existing cultural values and ideals. Walser illustrates this alternative by means of an analogy. Discovery resembles the work of the executive, which is to find, proclaim, and then enforce the law. Invention is legislative. It is the work of representative men and women, now I'm quoting Walser, who stand for us all because they could be any of us. As we can no doubt attest, this is the kind of procedure at stake in the fiction of the Rawlsian veil of ignorance. Finally, interpretation is to be understood as a judgment, the work of the judicial branch of government. Now, Walser's descriptions of these three alternative paths do not intend to be exhaustive. In a way, he is only sketching ideal types, useful to roughly understand the most important characteristics of what it takes to be the more common approaches to social criticism. Nonetheless, far from limiting himself to a merely descriptive approach, he forcefully makes the case for the choice of one of these criticisms, namely interpretation. Now, for Walser, in here I have a slightly longer quote, which is here. For Walser, the claim of interpretation is simply this, that neither discovery nor invention is necessary because we already possess what they pretend to provide. We do not have to discover the moral world because we have always lived there. We do not have to invent it because it has already been invented. A little bit down. The whole thing lends itself less to abstract modeling than to thick description. Moral argument in such a setting is interpretive in character. End quote. Now, this is Walser from Interpretation and Social Criticism. So discovery draws its force from revelation, either divine or scientific. In a way, it rests on a claim of authority. Invention, on the other hand, is creative. It assumes that we do not need an external authority to arrive at the best possible norms. We only have to draw them from our own rational consensus. Thus, morality detaches itself from the need of a transcendent basis. But it is still an effort at escape from the already existing norms, an effort to find a universal yardstick against which we could measure every possible existing action and value, thereby criticizing them in light of that universal ideal. Now, according to Walser, the moralities we discover or invent actually turn out to be remarkably close to those we already have. Usually, what we do when we engage in a discussion on morality is to use already existing moral concepts and intuitions. Accordingly, social criticism is more likely to draw a thick description of moral norms and social realities rather than discovering them somewhere or inventing them altogether. So what constitutes the moral life of a given society or a group within it? Well, it's historic ideals, public rhetoric, foundational texts, ceremonies, and rituals. Here I have another quote from Walser, a smaller one, and it tells us, it's not only what people do, but how they explain and justify what they do, the stories they tell, the principles they invoke that constitutes a moral culture, end quote. Now, what is striking is that these are not mere facts that could be rendered by a purely descriptivist or positivistic approach. However, these moral these moral facts have to be read, here I'm quoting again, Walser, have to be read, rendered, construed, glosed, elucidated, and not merely described. Thus, end quote, thus, such a moral fact can be justified or not according to what we make of it, to the interpretation we offer of it. The social critic will sometimes confirm, sometimes challenge received opinion. Moral life, we could say in recurrent terms, is subject to a conflict of interpretations. Now, the corollary to this condition of social criticism is that, according to Walser, we do not actually need a critical distance from our own particularities and values in order to exercise social criticism. He defends the need for a type of connected critic that argues from the inside. As such, we do not need to step back from society as a whole, only from unjust power structures like those that lead to domination. Clearly, The kind of critique that Walzer is defending is akin to what is called in the tradition of critical social theory, immanent critique. And with this in mind, let us now turn to Honneth's reading of these paths of moral philosophy and social criticism. Now, Honneth does not consider the procedure of discovery as being philosophically relevant, so he just drops it. So he chooses to focus on the procedures of invention and interpretation, but renaming them respectively as construction and reconstruction. So this is taken from an article published in English in 2009, Reconstructive Social Criticism with Genealogical Proviso. Then there are meaningful developments in freedom's rights, but I'm not going to go into them. I'm focusing on this text because this is a text in which he is analyzing Walzer closely. And so I think it's better to just focus on this particular period of Honneth's critical theory. So he renames the two paths proposed by Walzer as construction and reconstruction. As construction is for Honneth what invention was for Walzer, and reconstruction is for Honneth what interpretation was for Walzer. But he also adds to the bundle the Nietzschean genealogical approach to social criticism, which aims at finding the root of a certain value in order to expose it as contingent and sometimes even tied to practices of power and domination. So Honneth's approach consists in distinguishing between constructivist, reconstructivist, and genealogical social criticism. According to him, the specificity of the Frankfurt School's kind of critical theory is a hybrid sort of social criticism that draws both from Hegel's progress towards rationality, the left Hegelian proviso, and Nietzsche's genealogical critique, the genealogical proviso. So Honneth then puts forward his own version of social criticism, which at this point in time he names reconstructive critique. The most significant way in which reconstructive critique is distinguished from what Walzer calls interpretation is that the context-bound critique, which is a very important step for Honneth, the context-bound critique is to be connected with the context-transcending notion of rationality. The reason for adding this element, so the claim goes, is, and here I'm quoting Honneth, that the moral principles that are contingently available in the value horizon of a given society initially lack any guarantee that they are in a certain way valid for its members. End quote. Thus, to the hermeneutical recovery of a certain morality, we must add the left Hegelian premise, which is, at each new level of social reproduction, reason must present itself in a more developed form. Thus, in each society, the immanent ideals chosen must be those that represent the most developed form of social rationalization. If a given society has available, among its guiding ideals, an ideal that can be shown to embody a higher form of rationalization or a more developed stage of moral progress, we have found a yardstick that we can use to criticize and transform reality. Now, Honneth insists, I must mention this point, because Honneth insists that this procedure is not purely hermeneutical, but he remains elusive on the way we should understand the interaction between the identification of the implicit norms guiding societies and the expression of rationalization. That is, how do we distinguish among the many and probably conflicting already existing values of a given society, which ones embody the higher rationalization principle? Nonetheless, he hints at the way we should put the immanent ideals to the test, not in what concerns their teleological tendency towards a higher degree of rationalization, but rather by operating their genealogy. He explains that the critique should be complemented by this genealogical proviso, which means the following. Given that the moral norm does not as such prescribe out of itself how it should be socially applied, its content can be transformed as a result of imperceptible shifts of meaning, so that, in the end, it might lose its justification. Here I make a very small parenthesis, but we are reminded of Laclau's and Muffa's discourse theory and of the way in which it is in the specific interpretation of our core values that lies the significant differences. For instance, when Muffa speaks about the contingent articulation between the traditions of liberalism and the traditions of democracy, within our practices of liberal democracy, it is very different if we interpreted them from the side of liberalism, as in the neoliberal interpretation, or from the side of the radical democratic tradition that is going to emphasize not the values of market freedom, etc., but the values of radical equality, and so on and so forth. So it is in the interpretation and justification of already existing norms that lie the important details. And so for Honneth, this means that we must study the real context of application of moral norms. In each case, we must understand whether the social norm that we are supposed to apply still is justified or not, whether or not it has been misappropriated and now serves unjustified purposes, a bit like Ricoeur when he speaks about pathological ideologies. So if a value or norm has, so to speak, lost its way, then the normative kernel of any value is never foolproof. As such, it must always be submitted to the genealogical test to see whether or not it still holds as a morally defensible principle. Now, with the Honnethian definition of reconstructive social criticism, understood as this hybrid between the hermeneutical recovery of immanent values and norms and the teleological tendency towards rationality, we come closer to understanding how hermeneutics and the project of critical social theory might be intrinsically connected. The striving towards a progressive rationalization points towards the goal of emancipation inherent in all critical theory. And the way immanent values are recovered is always to be rooted in a hermeneutical procedure, even if we presuppose its left Hegelian complement. In a way, we can argue that hermeneutical social criticism is thus an important parcel of any project of social hermeneutics that intends to be transformative. Allow me now to briefly expand on some other distinctive traits of social hermeneutics that perhaps strengthen the case of its use for purposes of social analysis. And so now I'm moving a little bit beyond the specific case of critique, hermeneutical critique, to which I will come back very briefly in my final remarks, but I just wanted to expand a little bit on my analysis, just briefly speaking about the tradition of social hermeneutics as such. Now, I would like to argue that some underlying traits shared by many in the tradition of social analysis, of hermeneutic social analysis, are the following. A vision of social hermeneutics, assuming that such thing exists between the diversity and multiplicity of authors that can more or less reclaim to be a part of the hermeneutical tradition, even if they do not themselves do it, and I did this exercise a little bit with Honneth, perhaps we would find the following shared traits. First, a contextual view of rationality. Second, an analysis of the entanglement between facts and norms in most interpretations. Third, a wager on the interpretive paradigm as an alternative both to idealism and naive realism. Fourth, a connection to a reflection on selfhood, intersubjectivity, and agency. And finally, as seen before with the discussion of hermeneutical social criticism, an interest in meaningful social change, that is, a practical vocation to tackle social problems. Now, a first question concerning the whole social hermeneutical project concerns the tension between the contextual reconstruction of meaning and the normative assessment that undergirds the justification for transformation. It is in this context that hermeneutical projects are often accused of relativism, but this objection is misguided. Hermeneutics, whether in its methodological or ontological versions, is chiefly concerned with interpretation. Even though there are distinctions between weaker and stronger versions of hermeneutics, I want to argue that although most hermeneutics will tend to reject naturalism and reductionism, and therefore put forward post-foundationalist and non-essentialist descriptions and normative claims, this does not amount to reducing hermeneutics to a relativistic project, as the objection often goes. To the contrary, positing a hermeneutic circle, spelling out the hermeneutics of action, or analyzing the interpretive texture of social reality and the way it impacts individual sense formation and the construction of selfhood, only forces us to pay closer attention to the intricacies of interpretation and the several ways in which it can be misguided. In other words, hermeneutics can be rule-based and set criteria distinguishing between better and worse interpretations according to, as Ricoeur argues, a logic of probability. Now, one notable feature of phenomenological hermeneutics, though, is its insistence on the importance of the first-person perspective and specifically on the operation of understanding. And even though not every hermeneutician will relegate explanation to the natural sciences as if it were to be left out of the human and social sciences, as is well known, Ricoeur refuses this move, a key concern of hermeneutics is to ultimately position knowledge and interpretation in the horizon of understanding, thus allowing us to grasp how meaning is conferred upon the self and the world through interpretation. Now, coming back to the 5 main traits that I mentioned before will allow us perhaps to unpack a little bit this specificity of the social hermeneutical approach. Now, first, the contextual view of rationality. Social hermeneutics pays attention to the plurality of ways in which rationality can express itself. As such, and in addition to rational features such as logical reason and the capacity to recognize evidence and be open to revise beliefs in light of evidence, hermeneutics is open to recognize other forms of rationality, for instance, those stemming from narrative imagination or communicative rationality. Furthermore, as I mentioned earlier, it is also prone to function in an epistemic mode of plausibility rather than demanding in every case foolproof certitude. Following the motto of Aristotle, often quoted by Ricoeur, we should, here I'm quoting Aristotle, look for precision in each class of things just so far as the nature of the subject admits, end quote. Which means, for instance, that in the domain of human action, including in the political and social domain, the assessment of beliefs and behavior has to take into account the context in which these beliefs and behavior are taking place. A given belief might make sense against the backdrop of a certain tradition or widely shared social practice, and thus, in that context, it should not appear as irrational for someone to hold on to it. If, however, such system of beliefs or ideology is debunked and the subject still holds on to it, his or her behavior can then be deemed irrational. But here, hermeneutical tact, so-called hermeneutical tact, and its attentiveness to particular situations and contexts can be invaluable. A second trait is the recognition of the entanglement between facts and norms in many interpretations. This feature is in line with the rejection of positivism and scientism, and it means that the very nature of speech, including in our use of thick descriptions, often blurs the neat distinction between description and interpretation. And so actually in this, the hermeneutical project is in the vicinity of Hilary Putnam somehow, as of the social analysis of what Clifford Geertz, for instance. Johan spoke a little bit about this in the last session. Now, the third feature is the wager on the interpretive paradigm as an alternative both to idealism and naive realism. This means that if, on the one hand, hermeneutics is far from relying on a cogito posited a priori, on the other hand, it also does not rely on mere empiricism. Its wager is rather on the analysis of the mediations between the subject and reality, which are made up by the complex web of interpretations whose origin, method, and result must be probed. How to properly form interpretations is thus a major concern, and this is a useful tool to understand how subjects acquire knowledge. The fourth trait is the connection to a reflection on selfhood, intersubjectivity, and agency. Indeed, in the hermeneutics of selfhood, what is at stake is always how the self makes sense of him or herself, in the case of recursive hermeneutics, through the mediation of the works of culture, including texts and theories in conflict, and more generally, through narrative. This analysis has a practical vocation, given that reading action as a text and reflecting on the self-interpreting animal as a being acting in the world entails discerning the possibilities for action. But agency is always exercised in the context of a common world, and as many hermeneutical philosophies, and notably those of Ricoeur and Charles Taylor, do reflect on the intersubjective conditions of possibility for selfhood to develop, and in this they are of course joined by Axel Honneth and his theory of recognition. Finally, hermeneutics' interest in meaningful social change is a feature of those hermeneutical projects that are closer to critical theory, and that we have discussed under the label critical hermeneutics when analyzing hermeneutical social criticism. And here allow me to note in passing that this includes a concern with the problem, also a concern with the problem of structural domination, including symbolic domination, and with what Miranda Fricker, coming from a different tradition of which I don't have time to speak in this presentation now, proposes to call hermeneutical injustice, that is, the gaps in the common hermeneutical resources of society that lead to symbolic exclusion. Taken together, I believe, these traits lend the social hermeneutical approach a distinctiveness, allowing us to grasp its own voice and its potential of cross-fertilization with other fields, such as the recently booming fields of social epistemology, epistemic injustice, as well as, of course, the tradition of critical social theory. Now, I am coming to the end of my time, and so just very, very, very briefly, allow me to make just some very brief final remarks. So in this presentation, we have seen some of the traits of the social hermeneutical approach, such as they can be reconstructed from an analysis of some of the main authors within this tradition, and we concentrated on the operation of hermeneutical social criticism with Ricoeur, Walser, and Honneth. There are, of course, notable differences between Walser's insistence on belonging and Honneth's call for a universal yardstick, and again, Honneth does not describe his project as being hermeneutical through and through, even though he recognizes its fundamental hermeneutical moment. Here, I suggest that coming back to Ricoeur might be useful. By insisting on the recovery of tradition, Ricoeur in hermeneutics can serve as a useful tool in the first step of reconstructive critique, that is, of properly identifying the implicit norms that guide each community. And since it also insists on the creativity of interpretation and on the need to have a strong component of innovation, it can understand precisely how different sets of rules and practices evolve and need to keep evolving if they are to meaningfully accommodate the ethical aims of historically evolving communities. Ultimately, this amounts to the dialectics between tradition and innovation, and as well as between belonging and distanciation, and recurring hermeneutics encompasses all these nuances. On the one hand, because it is very attentive to history and to the way in which personal and collective identities unfold historically. On the other hand, its emphasis on the unpredictability of human action and on the need for a constant renewal of the process of interpretation makes Ricoeur actually a forceful advocate of social change. Everyone belongs to specific traditions, and distanciation towards them is often difficult. In a way, every good social critic always remains, at least up to a certain point, a connected critic in Walser's definition. But one must also be, at critical turning points of social change, be able to distance himself or herself from a certain symbolic order, or from certain values in that symbolic order, or at least from certain misled interpretations of those values that can lead to unjust social practices. Now, this whole interpretive process is traversed by normative evaluations and done through the critical lens. I hope I was able to present, even if in a very cursory manner, the distinctive status of social hermeneutics and its critical function, and to make the case for rekindling once again its potential. And now let me just thank you for your attention and stop sharing. Yes, there's also the references, even though they are very scarce, and the acknowledgements to the creators of the PowerPoint templates, which are also very important. And now, without further ado, stop sharing. And we've agreed with